Camera. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Civic Tech Talk tonight. And I think we already introduced ourselves. My name is Da, and my colleague Sourabh is online there. And we both work for the city or in the Environment and Climate Division. And our job is to use models to provide more insights on the greenhouse gas emissions and our energy systems. So today we're very excited to be here talking about the modeling suite we're using. So the modeling suite we call LENZ, which stands for local emissions for net zero. And we want to highlight how we can use that model to provide some technical support for the city towards its transition to net zero. Okay, so yeah, this is the outline for today. I'll first give a brief overview of the city's net zero strategy, and then we'll talk about the model and how it works, and then we want to highlight some insights we gain from the model and how that's guiding us to a more efficient or a better climate policy making. Okay, so the history of the net zero strategy at the city can trace back to 2015 when the first proposal called Climate Action Strategy was proposed, aiming to reduce 80% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And it was soon adopted by the city council. And in 2019, the city declared a climate emergency. And we revised the target to make it more ambitious, which is to achieve net zero by 2040. So after that, 2020, we have this new strategy called net zero strategy. I'll refer to NZS. So it's a very detailed strategy and supported by some modeling work using the city insight model. And after that, 2021, the new net zero strategy was adopted by the city. And since then, I think we're in the implementation stage of the net zero strategy. But if you look back, so many years has passed, but our emissions still high. It hasn't gone down for much. So we only have 16 years to go. So a lot of things need to happen within this time frame to make sure we are on the correct pathway to net zero, right? So that's why modeling is very, very critical. These technical models that help us identify where we are now and where we are heading in the future, depending on different strategies, different actions we take. So if you look at this chart from previous modeling results, I'm showing 4 scenarios. Each line represents 1 scenario. So the top line here is the business as usual. So if we do nothing, our emissions will basically keep as like at today's level, right? Around 15 megatons of CO2 per year. And the next one we model is business as planned. So those means we implement some actions that are already approved by the council, but mostly just near-term actions. It will reduce emissions by like 30 to 40%. Obviously, it's not enough. If you look at the black dot here, that's our target for 2030, right? So we're still far away from that. So we have to be more ambitious there until we on the 2040 net zero pathway, right? So, but if you look at the 2040 net zero trajectory here, you see a very steep slope, especially between 2025 and 2035. That's when we need to accelerate those mitigation actions. We call it phase of accelerated reduction. So 2025 is just next year. So the next 10 years are very critical for us to reach net zero in the city. Okay, let's go back to the model. So this is the architecture of the LENZ model. It basically has 3 major components. The core component is called TMOA, TO. So it is developed based on the TOMOA framework, which is the energy optimization framework. Is open source, and we customized it to the city. It covers 4 main sectors: transportation, buildings, waste, and of course energy, which is embedded in all other sectors. And then we have a silver TO, which is a short-term electricity system planning model, which captures the electricity load on all the distribution lines and the transformer stations within the city at a hourly resolution. So, and the linking to that bridges to model. So we take the output of TOMOA and feed into silver to test our grid capacity to support some actions. Okay, so for the features of the model, we want it to be open source. It's written in Python, and the code is on GitHub. Anyone can take a look. And we want the model to have optimization capability, which I'll talk about this later, and have a high temporal and spatial resolution. Okay, so so this is an example of how we're using the model to identify critical actions to reach net zero, right? So this is what we call a wedge diagram. As you can tell, the dashed line on top is the do nothing scenario, right? So the bottom line is the net zero 40 trajectory. That's where we want to go there, right? So anything in between that space, we need to fill in with all the different actions for different sectors in order to reach that level, right? So, and we color-coded each sector. If you look at the energy sector on top, we identified, the model help us identify several major actions we need to take. For example, reduction of natural gas usage in the city, and the increased integration of renewable energies. For the transportation sector, basically we need to increase low carbon transportation options by, for example, electrifying our vehicles, and also promoting walking or biking in the city. And for the building sector, which is another major contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, we're establishing new building energy performance standards, and that will include deep retrofit of some existing buildings to, for example, phase out natural gas appliances in our buildings, right? So if we successfully implement all those actions, we'll be able to reach our net zero target. So the another key feature of the model is that it optimizes our energy system based on the least cost principle. So and I'll just keep track of emission, that's it. It also calculates cost associated with each actions, right? So that allows us to also test multiple financial policies, right? For example, we increase carbon tax, or we provide some rebates or other grants to support renewable energy, etc. We can also do that in LENZ. So if you look at the key idea behind this model, basically we have the left panel is the resources we have to generate energy. So on the other side, we have the end-use demands, right? So electricity demands or fuel demands by from the city, right? We need to meet all these demands using the resources we have. So the model's job is to optimize the energy system to meet that demand. But it will, I think there's 3 key notes here is that it will identify the least cost pathway so it doesn't create a lot of financial burden on the city, but also it will honor policies and keep the emissions within a limit, right? So this is how the objective function works model. And if you look at more detailed into what technologies are being covered in the LENZ, actually we cover over 1,000 technologies with different efficiency or retrofit levels and a few types, right? So here I'm just giving an example of an old, I don't know if you can read, it's old residential apartment building, right? The model covers, for example, from your furnace to a lighting to a range to a freezer to your dishwasher to your refrigerators to other appliances that consumes energy to a clothes dryer. So basically all the major energy consumers in a building are covered by the model. And if you look at the transportation model, we have a railway buses, like all the GO buses covered here, your passenger vehicles, whether it's a gasoline vehicle or battery electric or hybrid or plug-in electric, all those fuel types are covered in the model. So it's thousands of technologies are covered in the model. And for the waste sector, we have the green bins, we have landfill, we have all the wastewater treatment plants modeled. So those three key components of greenhouse gas emissions are being modeled here in LENZ. Okay, so Sourabh, my colleague Sourabh will continue and talk about other aspects.
All right, thank you, Da. So as Da mentioned, it's an optimization model. So it needs certain inputs and outputs, and it needs certain inputs, and it does some calculation and produces some outputs. So for example, it's like a demand-driven model. So user have to specify certain end-use demands. So for example, a city needs lots of services. For example, to run in buildings, you need appliances, you have clothes dryer, you have washer, dishwasher, lighting, space heating, space cooling. Then in transportation, you have passenger kilometers. Like and in waste sector, you have waste generation that needs to be managed. You need transportation services. So all these services are fixed, have to be user defined. These are exogenous. And then model has certain technological options and energy resources. For example, electricity, natural gas, and technology. That model can optimizes, like make a combination of that to meet these demands. So model needs like the value for these demand services, how much demand needs to be met by the city, what technological options model has, what energy resources that are available, and that the cost data in terms of investment cost, in terms of operational and maintenance cost. And the user can also specify certain constraints, for example, how much emissions the system can produce, or how fast system can transition towards net zero. And then it optimizes. It uses a linear optimization method, and then the output it produces is what technological mix or energy mix is most suitable to meet those goals that you have specified for the model. And then it also produces certain cost of meeting that goal and the emissions of that particular pathway. Next slide, please. Yeah, so model is highly disaggregate. For example, as Da already mentioned, but here you see, so for example, in building sector, we have four categories: residential building, commercial building, industrial building, public building. And in residential building, there are three archetypes: apartments, uh, single attached and single detached. And within apartment, there are different end use services. So for example, in case of lighting, there are different technologies that model considers. And for each technology, there are different variations. For example, standard efficiency of that technology, energy star rated or highly efficient. So you can see it because of it, it considers like very specific detail of a technology of even a lighting, a light bulb. So it makes it highly data intensive, but it also makes it highly flexible to test different policies. So for example, next slide, please. So because of this flexibility, we can answer several policy questions for City of Toronto. So for example, what say if the council or policymakers have certain questions, okay, we have these policies we want to implement, tell us about how much emissions it will reduce or how much it would cost, etc. So we can answer those questions. So for example, a question you may have is, suppose if uh, we have lots of electric vehicles on the road. We have 10 or 20% share of electric vehicles. What the impacts would be? So we can test that. And then TGS is Toronto Green Standards, is for building, to make building more efficient and sustainable. So if we adopt certain standards, the policymakers would like to know the cost and the impacts on emissions of those policies. On the other side, you might also consider, for example, you want to reduce certain emissions. You say you want to reach net zero by 2040. Give us the most optimal solutions. What the solution would be. So these are kind of policy questions that using this model, we can answer it. So overall, we have divided these questions into three categories. One is policy based. So policy based is more about, like, you specify certain policies that you want to have 10 or 20% of vehicles on the road should 10 or 20% of cars should be electric, or you want to have certain efficiencies. So you specify a pathway and tell model to give you the impacts of those choices. The other category is target based. So you say, okay, I don't care about what pathway we choose. Finally, I want to reach net zero by 2040 and give us the most optimal pathway. And the third category is hybrid. So it's a mix of both. You say, okay, I want to reach net zero by 2040, but at the same time, I want to constrain what pathways I can take. Perhaps I cannot have rapid adoption of electric vehicles. It's not logistically possible. Or I cannot have highly efficient buildings because you cannot tear down the existing infrastructure. So you can put those constraints and model can still produce certain output. Next slide, please. So here is a sample output that model produces. So for example, in case of emissions, you can see the trajectory that, okay, there are different emissions are coming from different sectors, but as you reach towards your target, emissions are gradually reduced by 2030 and 2040 from different sectors. The model also gives you cumulative investment that you would need to reach your goal. And it can also give you a snapshot of energy mix that you have now versus you might have once you reach your target of net zero by 2040 or 2050. Next slide, please. And there are more specific outputs that you can also get from the model, like that are sector specific output. So for example, the emissions that you have from residential buildings, where those emissions are coming from, the emissions from commercial buildings. And you can also break it down further where those emissions are coming from within residential building. So for example, most emissions are coming from using natural gas for space heating. But as you transition towards net zero, either you replace heat pump with, replace boilers with heat pumps that run on electricity, or you replace natural gas with more biomethane or more sustainable sources of energy that produce heat, but no emissions. Or you can also have some policies like I mentioned about Toronto Green Standards that are for buildings that require certain retrofitting of buildings and energy conservation measures. So you can also estimate the potential energy savings from specific policy measures that you have. Next slide, please. So overall, LENZ has like several capabilities. It's a mathematical model, but it's highly complex. But once you start using it, you can test different policies. So for example, if you have certain policies that you want to test in terms of their cost and the impacts on emissions, you can do that. You can also use it to find optimal policy to reach a specific goal that you have in mind. So for example, in case of city, it's a net zero goal that you want to reach, and we can come up with certain optimal solution that's least cost to meet that goal. Or you can also test certain sector specific policies to get specific insights. For example, you want to have electric vehicles on the road, or you want to have certain specific energy conservation measures that you want to have on the buildings. So because of its like flexibility of the model, you can test all these policies as well. Next slide, please. So all this information is also available on our website, and currently like we are also creating new scenarios for the city to be presented for this fall and the following year. And if you have more questions, do let us know. We are happy to answer all your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Sourabh. We only have about 10 minutes, maybe just a little less for, or we have like 5 minutes for questions. Yeah, well, let's give it 5 minutes. So we'll, and then I forgot to ask, are you able to stick around and have a breakout conversation with people to answer questions, both of you, one or both of you?
Yeah, I can.
Great. Okay, so yeah, so there'll be lots of time kind of afterwards. So maybe let's take one question from the room, one question online, and we'll see where we get to from there. If you'd like to ask a question online, throw a Q in the chat, and Alex will call on you. We have a question in the room. I see Ushnis got their hand up first.
Hi, is this City of Toronto's procurement database robust enough to collect the granular data that you, like, does the city know how many vehicles it has, what type, how many projectors it has, what make and brand, how many light bulbs does it have, what make and brand and what year? Like, are we making real big blanket assumptions when we're gonna input the data?
Yeah, data is heavy for this work, as you can tell. So there are multiple data sources. So I would say I haven't figured out all of them. We have to collaborate all other divisions like Toronto Hydro, TTC, all these individual agencies, organizations. They provide data to us. So now, so the granularity, the resolution highly depends on the quality they provide us. So we don't generate data, we basically take their data. But to me, if I look at the transportation sector, it's pretty high resolution. We know how many liters of diesel are used each day by our GO train, how many vehicles are on the road, those data we have. But in terms of how many light bulbs in a building, I don't think we reached that level yet. But Sourabh, I don't know if you have some things to add.
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, like we say, no, garbage in, garbage out. That's typical thing. If the data is wrong, then output will also be wrong. So you're right, like it's a data intensive model, and we do have some data are highly accurate. For example, the data that city provides in terms of buildings of different category, you can count like how many buildings there are and their sizes. But when you go down to like more smaller scale, like more granular data in terms of appliances, there are certain assumptions that need to be made. So some data in terms of energy consumption of appliances or space heating comes from I think Statistics Canada data or Natural Resource Canada data. They conduct surveys and estimate provides how much energies are used in buildings, but they generally provide data at provincial level. So we had to make some assumptions to convert that provincial data into a city level data. Then in terms of technological data, cost data, we are using NATEM. It's North America Times Energy Modeling. So they have like a very, I think, robust database. But you're correct. Like much of our data is not specific to Toronto. It's either North American specific data. Some data are Toronto specific. Some data are Ontario specific. Some data are Canada specific. So there are different scales of data that we are using.
Thank you. And then Alex, who got the first question in online?
Okay, so the first question here, Jasper.
Hey, thank you so much for the presentation. That was really nice to see the modeling. I'm curious about the scalability of the model. Obviously, this specific model is built for Toronto. I'm curious if, either this or, does it have to be built separately for different cities? So I'm just curious about the scalability of similar models.
Yeah, it can be applied to any other cities as long as you have the required data input. But of course, we made some adjustment for the city Toronto specifically. But the framework, the TMOA framework, is open source framework used by, I think, many different other cities. So yeah, the unique part of this model is that we have a linking tool and linked it to the Sourabh model, which is kind of Toronto specific electricity planning model that will give us more information on how we plan the future electricity grid. That's a unique part. But the core part of the model, TOMOA, can be applied to any other cities. But again, the key here is the data, right? You need to convert all those data into the format that the model supports, right? So that's the most difficult part here. But it's a highly versatile, I think, in terms of how you want to use the model for other cities.